I'm sure, like me, you will have known in your life times of desperation. Those times, they may be fleeting or they may be extended periods of time when you feel overwhelmed by something, whatever it might be, that life has thrown at you. When you are so desperate that you will try to find a resolution to your predicament, and that you will try every and any means possible to try and resolve it. Where perhaps you might seek out others to find who have been in a similar situation, to find comfort in sharing, or perhaps somebody who can empathize with you, who is going through a similar situation. Such times can be caused by a variety of reasons: relationship breakdowns, issues at work, illness, poverty, unemployment, grief and loss, to name just some examples. A dictionary definition of desperation reads, the feeling that you have when you are in such a bad situation that you are willing to take risks in order to change it. And you are willing to take risks in order to change it. Our gospel lectionary passage for this morning has presented us with three characters. Matthew, a tax collector, a bereaved synagogue leader, and a woman with a chronic long-term illness. And each one of these characters, in some way or other, was desperate, was in desperate need, whether they recognized it or not. And each one of them will see a transformation in their lives because of an encounter with Jesus. Because encounters with Jesus lead to transformed lives. In these three examples, they all seem to act with a simple faith that believes that who Jesus is and what he says is true and powerful. And we're going to look at each of these characters to see how Jesus helps them. Firstly, we're going to think about the woman with the persistent bleeding that had been blighted for 12 years of her life. Her desperate situation is one of health, more specifically, a lack of good health. And we know, don't we, that chronic illness can have devastating effects upon a person's well-being. In an article entitled Living with a Chronic Disease, it says, living with a chronic disease is challenging as it interferes with physical, mental and social functions, thus greatly affecting a person's quality of life. Chronically ill patients face major struggles, such as social isolation and loneliness, fatigue, pain and discomfort, feelings of distress, anger, hopelessness, frustration, anxiety, and depression. This woman lived in a time when medical interventions and the plethora of procedures and medicines that we have today was non-existent. But she also lived at a time and in a highly religious society, which meant that because of her illness, she was cut off from her community, adding to her distress. Her isolation was because of the strict Levitical laws, which we read about in the Old Testament book of Leviticus. I know that you all read it constantly, so you're up to date with it, but I'll refresh your memory. It says this: when a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time, other than her monthly period, and has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge. just as in the day of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period. And anything she sits on will be unclean, as during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. Unclean in this context means having a physical or moral blemish, which meant being labelled impure according to the Levitical laws, and therefore being subject to the requirements of the law. And as you can see, it was pretty harsh treatment. Here in Matthew's Gospel, in this account, this woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, would have been classed as unclean for all of that time, which would have ruined her life. Her associations with her husband, if she was married, or if she was unmarried and was hoping to be married, would have been ruined. It would have meant being separated from her family, her friends, and her neighbours, being singled out and living a desperate life, which is what lies behind her statement when she says to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be healed." That's desperate faith. That's faith that has tried every other avenue open to seek a resolution, but which have all failed. Indeed, in Mark's account of this story, he tells us that she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. She was all of those things that we read in that list from that article I mentioned a moment or two ago, living with a chronic disease. But because of her encounter with Jesus, she is healed and her life is transformed. Like this woman, the synagogue leader was also desperate and also showed his desperation in his faith, but for different reasons, because his daughter had just died. And so the root of his plea for desperate faith is grief, is loss. Now we know, don't we, that death is a natural cause. It comes to us all. But whenever it does come, it can be distressing, and particularly so in the case when it is the death of a child. But the synagogue leader tells Jesus what he believes, even in the midst of such a desperate and bleak situation, namely that Jesus can undo death with just a touch of his hand. It's fascinating if you put these two examples together, as Matthew has, and to think about the order in which they come in the gospel, in relation to the ceremonial laws of cleanliness, those laws that we read about in Leviticus, because they weren't just laws that were there set aside, that people maybe looked at occasionally. They were the laws that governed the way in which people lived out their lives. The woman who had been subject to bleeding touches Jesus' cloak, which would have automatically meant that he became unclean and would have been subject to the very strict purification rules before he could have been allowed back into the community. But it's Jesus' touch of the dead girl, which would also have brought a state of uncleanliness which brings her back to life, even though the law would have strictly forbidden there to be any contact. What we're seeing here in Jesus' actions, some might call them reckless actions, is a breaking down of the religious laws that govern the people so tightly, so rigidly. Jesus replacing them with love and grace and mercy. And that leads us on to the third encounter with Jesus. That transforms a life. That of Matthew, the tax collector. Now, this encounter is rather different to the subsequent ones. Both the woman and the synagogue leader, they recognized that they were in need, and they came to Jesus. But in Matthew's case, Jesus goes to him, recognizing that this man is in need, that he needs help, even though perhaps Matthew doesn't see this at first in his own life. It's a very simple and short encounter, isn't it? If you miss it, if you blink, you may have missed it. The gospel tells us, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him. And Matthew got up and followed him. And that's it. And on the face of it, it's a calling story. But it's much more complex than that, because we know that tax collectors were not the sort of people that you would hope to find on your guest list, nor would you hope to be associated with. Tax collectors were seen as either being dishonest and devious, taking more than what they were required to gather, or as collaborators with the hated Roman occupiers who they worked for. And very often, tax collectors were seen as being both dishonest and traitors, which made them doubly undesirable. That's why, when Jesus has dinner with Matthew, and more of Matthew's colleagues show up, there's this backlash from the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, who demand to know why Jesus, a rabbi, a holy man, is mixing with sinners and tax collectors. Sinners and tax collectors. What Jesus is doing here is shining a light on the society of his day and showing up the deficiencies and the hypocrisy of the religious leaders who express their disapproval of Jesus' actions. Their question to his disciples has the implied criticism that he shouldn't be associating with such people, and that in turn he should not associate with them either. To which Jesus responds with a very short parable. It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Now, we know, don't we, that the role of a doctor is health, to bring healing, to bring restoration. And this parable points to Jesus' role, that of a doctor, bringing not only physical healing, but spiritual healing too. In this context, the sick are the spiritually unhealthy tax collectors and sinners who are clearly in need of Jesus' help and healing. But by contrast, the Pharisees thought that they were already the healthy ones because they followed the law to the letter. At least that's what they taught others to do. But they didn't always themselves do what they said. And later in Matthew's Gospel, we read Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and unclean, and everything unclean." You see, the role of the Pharisees should have been one to help people, the sick, the dying, the lost, the outcast, the sinners, the tax collectors. But they lost sight of compassion. And Jesus leaves them with this thought: I desire mercy, not sacrifice. In other words, all of the sacrifices, all of the offerings, all of the prayers, all of the worship count for nothing if mercy is not shown, if love and compassion and generosity are missing. Matthew's encounter with Jesus changed the way of his life, because it revealed to him the wrong paths that he had taken. And he turned his life around and followed Jesus, becoming one of his disciples and writing the gospel story that we are now reading. A truly transformed life. Because encounters with Jesus lead to transformed lives. And that's what these three examples show us in our gospel reading today. But it's also a reminder that still today, encounters with Jesus lead to transformed lives. You and I are witness to that. We are living transformations because we have met with Jesus. And it doesn't matter how old or how young you may be, no matter what you may have done in the past, Jesus wants to meet with you to bring healing and restoration to your life in all aspects of your life: physical, spiritual, emotional, so that we may live lives worthy of the calling we have received as children of God. As we close, listen to these words from the Apostle Paul, writing to the believers in Ephesus, encouraging them how to live out their lives as followers of Jesus. Words that are as relevant today as they were back then. He says this: "As a prisoner for the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." Thanks be to God. Amen.